The report Pathways, a New Approach for Women in Entrepreneurship was commissioned by the Scottish Government to investigate the under-participation of women in entrepreneurship and to explore ways to unlock the untapped potential of these women. Mark, why was this report necessary? What has the data shown?
I think this report's necessary, Nina, because although there have been many initiatives over many years to address the imbalance of participation in entrepreneurship, that structural imbalance is still very much in evidence. And at the rate it's improving, it's going to be, hundreds of years before we get to parity there. So I think what's needed, and this report attempts to be part of that voice, but what's needed is a view that says, how do we get realistically to equal participation in entrepreneurship? Now we can talk about why that's important, etc., and I'm sure we'll do that. But how do we get there realistically? Because what we're currently doing isn't really working, and I think that's why this discussion's necessary. So the report aims to do two things. It aims to, first of all, provoke on this issue to say, look, the current status quo, although we've accepted it as normal, is actually abnormal in a functioning society. And then it tries to unpack the structural cause and effect that leads us to always be in this position with a view to then being able to do something about it. So I think that type of approach, that type of input is necessary to this argument.
When you were doing your research, Mark, did you see any understanding of why we have accepted this as our normal for so long?
Yeah, I think you see different awareness levels and in different constituencies. So I think a lot of women understand very well why we see these imbalances, and women who have tried to, and in many cases successfully, move through the entrepreneurial sphere have lots of insight into all the prejudices, social biases, etc., that create an implicit belief in society that men are supposed to be in positions of authority and in positions of leadership and are more entrepreneurial. So many women understand this problem very well. I think if you're a man, and by no means do I wish to generalize because there's a whole range of views, but we saw a lot of evidence, and I've seen it before in my career as well, of successful male entrepreneurs being reluctant to accept that there's societal barriers to participation if you're not, white male, for example, of middle class origins or above. That target group has the easiest time in entrepreneurship. It's not easy, but relatively speaking, it's easiest time. And if you're a product of that system, and if you're successful as a result of that system, it's actually much harder to accept that the system may be broken, because after all, it successfully surfaced due, so it must work quite well. So I think we saw, surprising ignorance, I may say, of the challenges that women face in the entrepreneurial journey. From by no means all successful men or all successful male entrepreneurs, but where we saw it, it was most evident in that constituency.
How do we make this topic of equal participation less uncomfortable for people to talk about? I know that this report is a really fantastic and huge jump forward, but how do we continue that?
Well, thank you for saying so. I think that all topics of this nature are initially uncomfortable, and that has caused us over many decades of increasing enlightenment to avoid talking about it, because it makes quite often influential people uncomfortable. So therefore we find other ways around the topic, and we practice displacement activities where we find simpler things to do, or we declare success on very incremental results, and then people can feel that we've addressed this issue. So I think we have to do the following things. We have to actually talk about the issue as it really exists, which is there's an extreme gender imbalance in entrepreneurship. We have to talk structurally and from a cause and effect perspective about why that is, excuse me, which leads us back to the fact that our society is at the outset sexist. We just have to be honest about that. And then we have to push through that period of discomfort where we don't, and I don't like having to say that, I don't like the fact that we live in a society that we want to be proud of that has these issues. It's not the only issues it has, but it has these issues. But we have to talk about it long enough to normalize the discussion so that we can then talk about solutions. So, it's not enough to have a report like this come out, an initial bit of noise, and we settle down. We need men and women talking to each other. We need men advocating on behalf of fixing this imbalance. And we need just to make everyone more comfortable about this issue, because until we do that, we'll never spend enough time to get to solutions. So I think that's the importance of precursor steps.
Thank you. Definitely agreed on that. Barbara, the report talks about formally defined pathways into entrepreneurship and how they're unclear, and how that informal pathways and networks underserve women. Do you see that in the CivTech process?
I think that when it comes to the CivTech program, which is, albeit a very small part of a much wider entrepreneurship ecosystem in Scotland, we would say that we really do welcome and recognise a lot of the issues that are being highlighted in the report. And actually, from the point of view of somebody who is aiming to support entrepreneurs generally, to be able to build businesses through solving public sector challenges, which is what we do, we both recognise the problems that are being highlighted. So the statistics highlighted in the report in terms of the levels of participation of in entrepreneurship by women are reflected in the applications that we see coming forward for our programme. So from the point of view of, first of all, talking about the problem and saying it is a problem that we've got lower levels of participation from female-founded businesses, we recognise that. I think the real opportunity this report presents for us is that it sets out in a really structured way a variety of different issues. Now, when it comes to CivTech, we are a formal route into entrepreneurship. So when we set a challenge, you can be anybody. As long as you've got the right skills and experience, you can apply to a CivTech challenge with an idea, and you can take that idea through to developing a product and building a business around that product. So we offer that formal pathway, which is one of those things that's highlighted in the report as being needed. And that is good, but there are so many other structural factors at play here in terms of the issues that make it harder for women to participate in those entrepreneurial opportunities. So the report provides us with an opportunity to, in a really structured way, look at those issues and push ourselves to say, right, we need to do more. And there are specific actions we hope to take as a programme around the different recommendations in the report. And the report's really providing us with that, I guess, the way of framing how we can respond and how we can do more to increase the levels of participation, really be aiming for parity. As Mark said, it's not good enough to accept slow incremental progress as success. We've got to be aiming for parity as really what we're trying to achieve. So that's where I'd say we kind of what the report's prompted us to reflect on and how we hope to move forward.
I think I also reflected on that as well, because sometimes I see slow incremental changes as such big wins because you've been working on them for so long, and then you want to celebrate those wins, and then you look back and you think, wow, we've got a long way to go, but look how far we've come. And so when Mark mentioned that, we should be holding ourselves to a higher standard, I really agreed with that, because when you've been in the trenches for so long, it's sometimes you can't see the weeds for the woods. But the report itself has 31 really comprehensive recommendations to close the gap. And obviously they're not exhaustive, but I was wondering if you had any idea about kind of the short-term recommendations versus the long-term recommendations, because some of them are quite shorter, some of them quite long, actually. And basically, I'm asking, are there any quick wins?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the answer to that reflects back on, I think, what you just said, Mimi. Why do we celebrate incremental progress? I think we celebrate it partly and I'd say largely because the society's inherent gender biases have anchored us on the idea that an extreme imbalance in, for example, entrepreneurship, which is the topic of today, but we could apply it to other topics, that's normal. That's what we call normal. We have normalized that extreme imbalance. So therefore, if you make a 1% improvement in that, people celebrate that because it's almost seen as a kind of optional and aspirational, but not essential change because normal is extreme imbalance. And I think what we need to do, first of all, is, in the discussion, if we summarize what we've talked about so far, it's about de-anchoring from that view of normal. That's why the report says we've got to start from why not 50-50. That's normal. That's what it should be. And then figure out why we're not there. So that as long as that anchoring exists, so, we're going to have to work to de-anchor, and that's a long-term project. That's about reprogramming our gender norms, for example, and our stereotypes about gender roles in society. So the report essentially takes two paths. One part is to try to start to address that gender programming, and we are not deluded here. A small report isn't going to overnight change that, but it really tries to encourage and push government to do some structural things to start to de-anchor us from that, so at least the next generation sees that happen. And then because all of the issues that Barbara referred to, the number of barriers in front of women, all exist because of those starting conditions. The question then is, in the meantime, what can we do to mitigate some of those? So Barbara mentioned, pathways are important, but they're not enough. So understanding how to get into entrepreneurship is a big issue because a lot of people, men and women, are not clear on that. It's a confusing picture. But if all we did, for the sake of argument, was clarify those pathways, unfortunately, for one half of the population, that pathway is replete with various barriers. So can we mitigate that situation while we're waiting for society to change at slower pace? And I'll give you an example of that, which illustrates the point quite neatly, I think. Because our society is inherently bound up in gender stereotype roles, we have assigned women the primary carer responsibility. And in many, many families, the majority of families, that means you're responsible for home management and all the 100,000 tasks that go with that, responsible as a primary carer. And when you carry those responsibilities around, it has constraining effects, not least the mental load that adds, but also the fact that if we open a shiny incubator in the centre of Edinburgh or Manchester, it's much harder for primary carers to access those facilities because they tend to operate radially around the city. I moved from the home to the nursery to the school to the doctor's surgery to the shopping centre, and I don't move into the city centre for 10 hours, do some startup work and come back because I've got to look after the children, I've got to prepare the house, etc. So no, it shouldn't be the case that the vast majority of primary care and home management falls mainly on women. And while we're trying to deprogram that, can we create a network of incubation and support services that actually go to where those primary carers are? And that's why the report talks about a kind of mobile incubation model, the pop-up pre-start, as we call them. We'll sort of go through all the details of those, but the point is that we're addressing the reality caused by that source sexism in society, that women are constrained in time and geographically. So we need to bring those services to them rather than ask them to come to those services. So that's a much easier thing to implement. Now, the question of will these things be implemented, that's a matter of political will. And I obviously, hope and urge the Scottish government or the UK government to step up here, because I think that the societal benefits are enormous and the economic benefits are enormous. But in summary, many of these recommendations, those that mitigate our inherent imbalances at source, are quite easy to implement quickly if the political will is there to do it.
Thank you, Mark. Barbara, I saw you nodding along.
Yeah, I think just coming back to the kind of quick wins points as well, I almost would say that as the report sets out, there are multiple structural issues, and as Mark's highlighted, there's the temporal aspect of the things that we need to do to mitigate those structural issues while you're working on addressing them. But it's also the case that just it takes time to change people's attitudes and behaviors. And I think that one of the things that's difficult is too often these types of issues try to be dealt with by very limited single pilots. You're not going to be able to change anything in terms of behavior with small scale pilots that are too limited in scope to be able to actually give people the confidence that they can change the types of decisions that they're making about their careers and the opportunities they have. So I'd say that it's really important when we're thinking about the responses to this that both we look at this in a multidimensional way. Trying to address one area at a time is not going to deliver the results, and that we have a view on this that says it will take time to change behavior. So by expecting results immediately, we will only set ourselves up for kind of perceived failure. We need to kind of accept that, yeah, it's going to take a long time to actually, especially if we're aiming for that big target of parity is what we should be aiming for.
Thanks, Barbara. It's really good to get that in, because oftentimes we forget how long it can take, and also the cost, right? The cost to governments to do this. But as you previously mentioned, the word opportunity is really key here. We can offset those costs eventually, but they take time. And so, Mark and Barbara, do you have any kind of idea about which of the recommendations you personally feel should be prioritized? So the recommendations cover a number of different things, from ensuring that women get a fair share of investment through quotas, tailored funding, obviously the support that you previously mentioned, Mark, about parental care and shared parental leave. Are there other things that you think should be prioritized?
So you've got building on Barbara's point, which I think is very important, that if we take individual initiatives and say, let's do that one, the risk is that because this is a system problem, if you don't provide a system response, these in isolation, these initiatives will fail. So I think you have to think about it as the report's called Pathways for a reason. And that reason is that we have to establish a sort of version one of a pathway from the early stage of entrepreneurship interest or sort of pre-interest through to you'll be able to get your first major investment and sort of go into the kind of world of markets and all that goes on there. So I think we need to do a basic implementation right across that pathway. So for example, our children are not exposed to entrepreneurial principles at all, boys or girls. We've got to start fixing that. We're losing a lot of entrepreneurs at the system. Those women, and I'm going to just use the example of in primary care roles who are constrained, we've got to give them a way of accessing entrepreneurial services. And we've got to recognise that because of various prejudices, various barriers to investment that a lot of women experience, we've got to find ways to give them some additional financial support to lengthen that runway while they build more credibility with the product, etc., to get into that mode. So, I don't think it's possible to just take one, for example. We have to follow the pathway through and say, let's get that working end to end, even in a kind of a basic initial way, and we'll learn from that experience. So I think that is super important. So I would start with things like, let's get the 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 pop-up pre-starts, the kind of taking support services to women where they are. Let's get that running. Let's put the concept fund and the journey fund that basically supports them through the early stages in place. And that's a kind of key part of that initial pathway. But really, to really start to see change over 5 years and 10 years, it's got to be accompanied by those other areas. And I have had a similar experience in government with an earlier report on the technology ecosystem in Scotland, and I found that it's very attractive for politicians to implement the thing that's a physical object that I can cut ribbons outside, and it's much less attractive to do the abstract stuff like the education of children and entrepreneurship, or the deprogramming gender stereotypes at university among students, and so on. It doesn't win you as many votes at the time because no picture on LinkedIn or Twitter. So I think the political challenge we've got to overcome is these have to come, not necessarily everything at once, but coordinated packages of intervention have to come together. Some of them have long-term benefit, some of them have short-term benefit, but if they don't come together, we dilute the value of all of them. And I think that's an argument that politicians in every country still have to learn. That's certainly true in Scotland. So that's how I think about it. It's got to be system level response. It's got to be more than just one at a time, and it's got to be more than just the ones we can cut ribbons outside because they make good photographs for publicity.
If I could build on that, Mark, I think that we are only a small program that is, as I said, supporting entrepreneurs, innovative businesses to be able to solve public sector challenges. That bigger picture for us is the setting in which we need to be operating in order for us to really have proper parity between female-founded businesses and male-founded businesses. So I couldn't agree more with those points about that systemic change overall is what needs to be prioritized. But similarly, we as a program have been inspired by that pathways point. So we've set out a set of, I think it's 8 different initiatives that we want to start undertaking. And one of them is when we set a challenge, a public sector challenge, which is a problem that a public sector organization wants to solve, we're wanting to get the most innovative ideas that we can in to solve that challenge. And right now, we do quite a lot of targeted work looking at specific groups of people to push our challenges out to. We do work with the existing organisations that are out there promoting women in enterprise across Scotland. And there's a lot of really great work from a wide variety of different organisations doing that work. But we've realised that that isn't enough. So, for example, we want to try doing things like actually taking headhunting techniques, for example, and seeing if we can't use some of those to try and attract more would-be female founders to come and apply to our program. But we've then, so that's right at the start of our process. But we've looked at each individual stage and we've said, we then also need to have the networks there for those female founders so that they can see those other, we've got great examples of really successful businesses from female founders that have gone through the program. We just don't have enough of them. So we have already, we want to create more of a network of those people that are around our program so that we're role modeling to those people who might not be sure about applying, whether this is the sort of thing for them. But more than that, we want to have that network of support there for those people that then do take the plunge, that apply, that maybe make it through to our accelerator stage. We've got a huge amount of support that we already offer, but what we realize is it's not just about there being the support there, mentors there, etc. It's about people being able to see people like them as going through the process. And get a lot of that peer support that can come from other people who've gone through not just the journey of a founder, but the journey of a female founder. So that goes all the way through our stages. I think maybe some of the things, funnily enough, coming back to your quick wins question, Nimi, though, that probably some of the stuff we will just do is then looking at how we make our decisions about our funding. Now, we don't make investment into companies, but the report highlights the issues of how people who are making decisions, both in terms of, for us, selecting companies and in terms of to be successful and move on to the further stages in our challenge, but also in terms of looking at, right, what's the level of funding that's actually being awarded to our female founders versus our male-founded companies? Are we actually challenging and looking enough at our own potential unconscious bias in those situations? So agree that it's that systemic intervention that we need, but the things that we should all be able to do if we're in a situation like we are as a program that's making decisions about companies that we're taking through or investment or funding that we're putting in, is ask ourselves the questions about the decisions we're making at the moment and where we might actually be embodying some of that systemic prejudice into decisions. And have we got the right sort of things that we can implement in terms of things like our panels, etc. We already do a lot when it comes to our scorecard. We're quite proud of the fact that from the early days of our program, we've had we actually score our companies on the basis of the diversity and inclusion that they're able to demonstrate of the teams that they bring forward, because we know more diverse teams deliver better products ultimately. But that's not enough. As I said before, we need to not pat ourselves on the back for doing that. We need to be looking more, actually, are those businesses that we're seeing coming forward, including that diversity in the founding teams. So there's a huge amount that, practically speaking, I think can be taken forward quickly, but it needs to be that bigger systemic picture that we address overall.
100%, Barbara. The kind of actions of looking inwards and using data to cut through our assumptions and biases is so vital and a huge part of the report. How do we keep this topic on the top of political agendas over the next year? Because this report is fantastic, but how do we keep the support that we've galvanized, and how do we continue building that momentum? Because ultimately, sometimes, initiatives or collective resources like this can be reduced to a women's issue. We see that a lot happening in women in tech, women's healthcare, for instance. How do we keep progressing this?
First of all, I think it's super helpful to have organizations like Barbara's doing what you're doing, because what you're doing is taking a set of paper and turning it into lived experience. And I'm not surprised that CivTech is doing that, because you're already used to, in a systemic way, addressing another sort of imbalance in society, which is governments only give contracts to big companies. And you've done, you're very modest about the small part you said that CivTech played, but that's an enormous part actually in the Scottish tech ecosystem in changing attitudes and risk appetites to working with startups, which is, in turn, a phenomenal stimulation to the startups we have in Scotland, because government money goes a long way. So, I think you inherently understand in your role as an ecosystem builder how to bring about change. And I think to your question, Amy, one of the things we have to do is our ecosystem builders have to start speaking out loud. I mean, what Barbara's described is fantastic, and I'm delighted to hear that you've got I think it's an 8-point plan about how you're going to bring the report to life inside that circle of influence that CivTech has, and the ripples that you will send through the ecosystem here will be significant by your actions. So I would urge you to talk about that, and your male colleagues, shout about it, challenge other similar organisations and ecosystem builders to explain what they're doing. That keeps it in the public discourse. It really also needs our politicians to regularly I might say incessantly talk about the progress they plan to make in this area. And I would urge our political leadership in Scotland and in the UK to start doing that. And I'm going to continue along with my co-author Anna Stewart to constructively apply pressure on government to respond to the set of recommendations and to talk about the progress they're making. That helps normalise that discourse. And then we need to recruit more male voices to this argument, to this discussion, because I'm conscious that, as a man speaking, I will reach a different radius, not a bigger radius, but a different radius than, say, Barbara will meet, because there'll be a lot of men out there say, oh, well, your women would say that, wouldn't they? And if we took that view, we'd still be sending children up chimneys, because children would complain about that, wouldn't they? So I think we need to recruit more male voices, and I would urge any of my male colleagues and others listening to this podcast to get courageous and start talking about this, because we all know, man and women across this country, we all know that there's an enormous economic opportunity if we bring more balance, because we just create a whole new set of entrepreneurs. And also there's a huge societal injustice that we choose not to talk about that I think we all know needs to be fixed. And it's manifest today in entrepreneurship in this discussion, but we know it's in the corporate leadership, it's all over our society. And we've got to start, men and women, talking about it and saying it's not acceptable. So if that happens, we'll make progress. If it doesn't happen, this will fizzle out and be another one of those reports.
Add to that, Mark, to say, I think thank you for the kind comments about CivTech, and we absolutely want to see it as our responsibility to take action on the report. And I think the way that it sets out in such a structured way the things that can be addressed is something that makes it easy to do, to be honest. I think that this is more kind of personal reflection than anything else, because I see the importance of us taking action as a programme. But for me, this is about the fact that as a nation, we can't afford to do nothing in this space. The economic opportunity of properly engaging women in entrepreneurial opportunities is huge. And we don't have a lot of answers right now for how we try and deliver growth. This is one of those areas, when you look at the macro level statistics and the fact that actually a huge part of the challenge in our economy overall is coming from the fact that you're getting quite a lot of women with really extensive experience in the workplace appear to be leaving the workplace and becoming economically inactive, particularly at the ages where they've probably got a huge amount of experience and a huge amount to offer. I think keeping it at the top of the political agenda is as much about saying that this is too big an opportunity to ignore, in terms of the fact that the country needs ways to be able to deliver growth. And yes, it's an injustice, but it's an economic issue as much as it is about the issue of equality.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. If you wanted to say what's the fastest way to dramatically increase our business creation and job creation in the country, well, it's self-evident that locking out almost half of our best people who are already here, we don't have to ask them to come to the country and get through all the immigration woes that we've inflicted on ourselves as a country. They're already here. So why wouldn't you do everything you could to put the support in place to allow that constituency to play a full part? You'd also lower your social security bill. So many benefits. So it seems an obvious thing to do. And it gets back to, we need to de-anchor from this idea that extreme underparticipation is normal. And that's why the report talks about that, because it's going to be a longer road, but if we don't start that journey now, then really in 10 years, the three of us would be a bit older, but we'd be having the same discussion. So it's got to be both. Let's do some things that make it easier within the prejudices and the frameworks we've put in place in society, wittingly or unwittingly. But we've also got to address that idea that the point Barbara's just made is in some way a novel point. What you've just said should be self-evident, but is a novel idea because our society says, but should they be like this? Shouldn't 80% of our entrepreneurs be men? Shouldn't 98% of our funding go to men because they're more risk-taking or more whatever the post-rationalization is? Until we start to break that down, we can only have a limited leverage here. So, you asked the question, what should we be saying about this and talking about? We've really got to start. Men have to talk about that as well. This authority gap we've embedded in our society, where if you ask the parents of male and female children to assess their intelligence, mums and dads will always, and you can repeat this experiment 100 times, it always gets the same results, will always overestimate the intelligence of the boys and underestimate the intelligence of the girls relative to their measured IQ. So you can see how embedded these behaviours are and how early they start to influence. We've got to be talking about that, and until we do, we're going to have a lot of these podcasts long into the future, and we're all going to be similarly frustrated. So this is the big moment, I think.
Agreed. And I really like what both of you have mentioned, that we're targeting it through societal collective interventions, but there's also a personal responsibility to sort of change the world around us.
In terms of those immediate opportunities for potential female founders, and indeed any founders coming up, the CivTech programme will be launching a new set of challenges at the end of June. And if they go to civtech.scot, they'll be able to sign up for our newsletter and find out about our programme as a fantastic way to move into entrepreneurship, solve a problem, build a business, and we really encourage and be delighted to see many more female founders or potential female founders come to find out more about the programme as we launch our next cohort.
Fantastic. I await that newsletter in my inbox. Thank you guys so much.